following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools, funded in part by the Virginia Satellite Educational Network.
This program was made possible through generous support from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation to George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens. The Real Martha Washington is a co-production of the Fairfax Network and George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens.
Hello and welcome to The Real Martha Washington. I'm Kate Sullivan and I'll be your host. I'm very excited today because in just a few minutes, Martha Washington will be here to answer questions from students in our audience, as well as those watching in our classroom here and those across the country. Now, before we meet Mrs. Washington, let's watch a short video about her.
George Washington's role in leading the Continental Army is well known in American history. How did Martha Washington contribute to the patriot cause and support the Revolutionary War and the soldiers who fought in it?
Well, Martha was a good general's wife, and of course she sort of created the role as she went along. But it became clear very early on that George wanted Martha to join him once he made winter camp. And so, beginning in 1776, she journeyed up to wherever the winter camp was for that year, and she settled in for the winter, and she made things comfortable for her husband, but more than that, she was a kind of morale booster for the troops in general. They looked to her as a kind of mother figure. They looked to her as kind of a piece of normalcy in a time of great upheaval. She also was a kind of aid to Washington. I mean, the burden of his job was so overwhelming that she at times would write letters, copy letters for him. She and other generals' wives or officers' wives would get together and they would knit, they would do needlework together, they would talk, they would have meals. They generally just tried to keep the spirits up, but keep people functioning in a way that they were most effective in their leadership roles as head of the military. So she had a supportive role, I suppose you would say, but Washington regarded her as crucial. And when he was submitting his expenses to Congress, he included as a request that Congress would reimburse him for the expenses of her travel. And this indicated to us and to him how much he valued her presence and how he regarded it not just as a service to him, but also as a service to the country that she was there.
Did Martha Washington have a political role in the nation's founding?
Of course, it always depends on what you mean by political. She, like other women at the time, could not vote or hold public office, and she wasn't interested in those things. But if you understand political to mean contributing to the overall life of the country, the political life of the country, the creation of a new early American republic, the creation of an independent nation, she very definitely had a role in that. One of the most interesting episodes, I think, was in 1780. A woman named Esther de Burt Reed in Philadelphia got the idea that it would be good if the women of the country showed their support for the troops in some very demonstrable way. And so she promoted the idea that women should go door to door collecting money for the troops. And she wanted to make a presentation to Washington of this money. Now, this was very unusual for women to be so involved in a kind of overtly political matter, but many women in Philadelphia undertook this, and Martha Washington took this as her own cause as well. And she wrote to Thomas Jefferson's wife, who was also named Martha, and asked her to collect money for the cause, and over $300,000 was raised for the support of the troops throughout the country. And so in this way, the women of the country felt that they could show in a very direct way that they supported the troops, and they wanted the money to go for shirts or for socks or for very basic necessities that the troops often lacked during the long war that the Americans were fighting. So in this way, I would say that Martha very definitely saw herself as making a political contribution, and she allied with other women who were doing the same thing.
Tell us something about the years of Martha Washington's widowhood when she ran her deceased husband's estate. Was she good at these duties? Were they uncommon responsibilities for a woman of the time to assume?
Martha was not expecting to be a widow. Her husband died suddenly after only a few years of marriage, but she assumed her role as the new head of household with vigor and dispatch. I mean, she was very good at her role. She was not, or she does not seem to be, intimidated by the new responsibilities that she had. It was not uncommon for husbands to die at this time, but a lot of times when they died, they left a will and they appointed an executor, usually a man, who would administer the estate. Now, Martha Washington was married to one of the richest men in Virginia at this time, Daniel Parke Custis, and since he did die prematurely, he had not made a will, and Martha Washington had to step in then and take over his responsibilities very quickly. And from what we can tell through her correspondence, she just did it immediately, and she started writing to correspondents, merchants, and factors in Europe, in England in particular, ordering new goods for the plantation, ordering supplies, ordering a tombstone for her husband. She just took over right where he had left off, and there doesn't seem to be any reluctance on her part to assume this role. So it was not unusual for women to have to do this, but it was not a role that I'm sure she welcomed, but she didn't shy away from it.
Martha's letters make it clear that family was a recurring and prominent theme in her life. How important was family to her, and what role did family play in her life?
Family was central in her own understanding of herself, in her own emotional life, in the own way she saw herself as a woman. And one of the most touching things I think about Martha Washington's life is how she had to reconstitute her family over and over because of death and disease, and because of the way that destroyed her families. So in her first marriage, 2 of her 4 children died in childhood. Then her husband died. She married George Washington. She, of course, did not have children with him, but George Washington took her 2 children more or less as his own and raised them, and she was very focused on raising them. I mean, she was anxious about their health. She was always worried about them. She was always interested in improving them, making sure that they got the proper education, which was different for a girl than for a boy, but she wanted them to be very well-educated individuals, appropriate to their status, which was as a member of the gentry in Virginia, a leading family of Virginia. Her daughter, Patsy, though, died when she was 17. She was epileptic, and she died very prematurely. Her son died in his 20s, although at this point he had married and already had 4 children of his own. So at that point, Martha Washington again had to remake her family, and again she kind of adopted 2 of her grandchildren and had them live with her at Mount Vernon, and this was with the consent of their mother, but they more or less stayed there constantly, and again she was rearing a family well into her 50s because she regarded her domestic life is really the center of her identity as a woman and of what she could contribute, and it brought so much pleasure to her and joy, along with heartache.
Here at Mount Vernon, George Washington is often referred to as the precedent president. That is, he established important presidential traditions, many of which endure today, despite a lack of existing models. Similarly, Martha Washington was the First Lady. What were some of the specific challenges of this position, and how well do you think she surmounted them? What significant precedents did she set?
Martha Washington was a reluctant First Lady. She really did not desire the role, but as with her widowhood, she assumed it with gusto. I mean, she did it with vigor, and she executed her duties in a most appropriate manner. Like her husband, George Washington, she was very aware that as the First Lady, everything she was doing would be closely watched and probably imitated by subsequent First Ladies. So there was always a caution in what she did. I think that, as I say, she was reluctant to take on this role. At one point, very early in George's presidency, she talked about herself as a state prisoner because she was so aware that she couldn't freely go out and be a private citizen in the way she was prior to his taking this office. She was also aware that the entertaining that she did had a public dimension now. It wasn't just strictly social. And very early in George's presidency, she established a precedent of having weekly salons. And these would be gatherings once a week where the important political leaders of Congress, of the cabinets, would come and gather in her drawing room. And it was meant to be sociable, but she was quite aware that this would bring individuals together who might not otherwise want to talk to one another or be in the same room with one another, that this kind of informal socializing would help grease the wheels of government and make political bargaining easier and make it more possible for government to function effectively at a time when, again, the precedents were just being established, when it was unclear exactly what the shape of this new government would be. She was also very aware that she shouldn't act like a queen, and so she had to walk this fine line between, being dignified, having people look up to her, but at the same time not acting regal or having any supposition that she was assuming too much authority to herself. I think the whole idea of this Republican court, of the idea of a weekly salon, was something that subsequent First Ladies did. Dolly Madison did it. Of course, Abigail Adams did it. So it was a more formal and official role for the First Lady than one might have expected. So I think that was an important position. I think other First Ladies subsequently, and I'm thinking particularly of Abigail Adams and Dolly Madison, were more interested in influencing political affairs than Martha Washington was. Martha Washington's home really was with her family, with domestic concerns, and as I mentioned before, she regarded herself as a state prisoner as First Lady. So I think that she did what was required of her, but I think that she wasn't interested in pushing the boundaries of being a First Lady the way some of the subsequent First Ladies were. But that just says that that's the kind of person she was, and she did the best in the job that she could.
Correspondence and other documents indicate that there was a remarkable connection or network among the Founding Fathers. Was there a similar networked connection between Martha Washington and other founding mothers of our nation?
Partly through her winter residence at the General's Camp, Martha Washington met a lot of the so-called founding mothers of the United States. One of the most interesting people she met was Mercy Otis Warren. Warren was a woman who, unlike most women of the time, was very well educated and who had written political tracts and plays opposing British tyranny. She would later go on to write a history of the American Revolution. And her husband was very active in the revolutionary movement as well. So through the connections of their husbands, Martha and Mercy Otis Warren met, and they became very friendly. After the Redcoats withdrew from Boston in 1776, they toured the ruins of the city together, and they were both disturbed by what the British had done. They corresponded in their later lives, and I think it was a person that Martha Washington felt understood what she was going through, could sympathize with her role, and even if she couldn't let down her guard, she could find someone who could really help her understand her role better and give her a kind of understanding that few other people had. Other wives of generals, especially the wife of General Knox, the wife of Nathaniel Greene, became good associates and friends of hers, and she spent many hours with them, and they had a network. Later on, when she became the First Lady, Abigail Adams became a close associate. I don't know if I'd call them friends, but again, only people who shared a similar situation could completely understand what she was going through and sympathize and give her support in this very uncharted territory.
We've always studied the Founding Fathers in school, but in recent years there has been a surge of interest in studying the Founding Mothers. Why do you think that these women and their contributions have been overlooked for so long? And why do you think there is a growing interest in learning more about their contributions?
The most obvious answer is that for a long time, men were the ones who wrote the history. And it is, of course, not until recently that women became very active politically in terms of running for office and serving in office. So I think there's a tendency, once that started to happen, to look back and see what earlier generations did. And I think that's a very useful exercise, and I'm glad we're engaged in it. I think we do have to be careful, though, to understand that Martha Washington and the women of her generation were very different from women today. They didn't have as much education. Most of them didn't aspire to the same kinds of careers as some women today. They had a more limited notion of women's possibilities and roles. And some of them chafed at those constraints. Others were very happy within that role. I would say Martha was very happy within that role and lived that role to the fullest and found a great deal of satisfaction in her role as the wife of George Washington, the mother and grandmother of many children, a good friend. And so I think it's useful to try and see the ways in which Martha Washington is a precursor to the political women of today, but we also have to be aware of the many differences.
What are your ideas of Martha Washington's views on slavery?
It's a very vexed and difficult question. She was a person of her time, and so Martha Washington accepted slavery as a natural institution, as something that was her right. She inherited a lot of slaves from her first husband, and these became part of the George Washington estate, and she never questioned the morality of the institution that we know of. Now, what's interesting is later in his life, her husband, George Washington, did begin to have doubts about slavery and made provision in his will to free his slaves. Since she had slaves that she had inherited from her husband, these slaves were not to be freed until her death, but people were so nervous after her husband died that the so-called dower slaves might try to kill her or poison her or rise up against her, that she actually freed her slaves early, but that seems to be an expediential decision rather than one based on her coming to some realization about the immorality of slavery. She had one slave in particular, a woman named Ona Judge, who was a very close personal slave of hers that ran away at the end of George Washington's presidency, and Martha wanted to stop at nothing, even at kidnapping, to try and get her back. She never did, and Ona Judge lived out her life, the end of her life, in freedom in New Hampshire. So you have to understand her limitations in her understanding of slavery. She was an upper-class woman of Virginia, and while she acceded to her husband's desire to free the slaves, she herself does not seem to have come to as much of a realization as he did about the necessity or the justice of that course of action.
All right, we have another question from our audience today. All right, who has a question? All right, how about this young man back here? What's your name and your question for Mrs. Washington?
My name is Cameron, and this is a question for the older Mrs. Washington. How did you and Miss Abigail Adams get along?
Oh, I like Mrs. Adams very much. She's a very fine person. I'm glad that she's going to help her husband. He really relies on her a good deal now that he's the new president. We're in our retirement. Many are beginning to refer to her in Philadelphia as Mrs. President. Something, though.
All right, a question from our studio audience. How about this young lady? Go ahead.
My name is Natalie, and I'm wondering were the hardships after the war?
Is that from...
during the war, I'm sorry.
That's for Mrs. Washington, the elder. Mm-hmm.
The hardships were so many. You know, our soldiers had very little food and clothes by the time they were in winter camp. Many of them were on the verge of starving, and they had worn out their boots and clothes. We ladies did everything we could to knit stockings for them and make shirts, but they were so very brave. Often they even shared their clothes when they had to sit up to be sentry. They sacrificed so much.
Let's have a question from our studio audience. Yes, this man right here, young man. What's your name?
My name's Matt, and I have a question for both of the Martha Washingtons. What were some of the important characteristics you played during the Revolutionary War?
Would you like to take that?
Certainly. I dare say that being supportive to Mr. Washington as he was traveling, and I care not so much for traveling myself, but it was his great desire that I should be with him, and that was a sacrifice I was willing to make.
All right. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, we should remember how many ladies helped with the war. Not only the officers' wives, but the enlisted men had their wives and mothers come and cook and sew and do the laundry. Without the ladies, the war could not have gone on. The soldiers couldn't have gone on. General Washington always remembered the ladies.
All right, another question now from our audience. How about this young lady in the blue? What's your name?
Amanda, this is for the young Martha Washington. I'd like to know, what were your kids' names and why do you name them that name?
Well, my two children that survived the longest were Martha Park Custis and John Park Custis, and they are family names. Martha for myself, and also my own mama, or grandmama, and Park is a family name of my husband, Daniel Park Custis. And Jackie, my youngest, my son John, were named for his grandfather, the Councillor Johncustis.
George Washington's role in leading the Continental Army is well known in American history. How did Martha Washington contribute to the patriot cause and support the Revolutionary War and the soldiers who fought in it?
Martha Washington made a tremendous contribution to the Continental Army. In fact, I can make the case that she kept the Continental Army together at various times when soldiers were threatening desertion by regiment. These were unclothed, unhoused, unpaid soldiers, unfed, and they were threatening no bread, no soldier. And Martha Washington would come into camp for the winter, and she went to camp every winter of the 8 long years of the Revolution, not just that winter at Valley Forge. And she went because George Washington begged her to come. He knew she was essential for troop morale. And it was dangerous for her to go. The roads were terrible. She was prime hostage-taking material for the British, and she was leaving behind duties at Mount Vernon that she worried about. But she would come into camp with her carriage filled with cloth and foodstuffs that had been made at Mount Vernon over the summer, one of the many contributions of African Americans to the Revolution. And she would be cheered into camp. Lady Washington is here. There were regiments named after her, Lady Washington's Dragoons. And then she would organize the officers' wives, and they would cook for the soldiers, they would sew for the soldiers, they would pray with the soldiers, they would nurse the soldiers, and put on great entertainments for them to keep morale up and keep the soldiers in the army. And she became a great heroine to the troops. And after the war, veterans would come to see her in New York and Philadelphia, and she'd bring them in and give them something to eat and maybe a little money and talk about old times. And she also lobbied the Congress for veterans' benefits. So she was very active on behalf of the Army.
Did Martha Washington have a political role in the nation's founding?
Creating the role of First Lady was a political act. It was a very dicey time. This was this brand new country. The European nations were not really taking us seriously. And so she had to create a role where it was grand enough for the Europeans to not laugh at us, but simple enough for Republican government. And that was very difficult. And she, like many first ladies since her, said she was basically a state prisoner. But she understood the politics of the situation, and she was always very well aware of public opinion and public appearances.
Martha Washington became a widow for the first time at a very young age with 2 young children, the wealthiest widow in Virginia after Daniel Parke Custis died. What kind of a role did she assume at that time?
After Daniel Parke Custis died, this young widow with 2 little children, and she had lost a couple of children, so she was nervous about these children, immediately took over the business. And some of the few letters we have of hers in this period are letters to England, essentially saying, I'm in charge now, correspond with me. To people who are suppliers, and a plantation was a big business, and she was running them. Martha Washington was a very, very rich widow, and as a widow, she could own her property, and she could manage her property, and she could actually even vote, but she probably didn't know it, and she gave that all up to marry George Washington. And according to the stories of the time, she was wooed by all of the eligible men of Virginia, as you could well imagine, and spurned them all, not wanting to give up her power, and then was swept off her feet by the hunk George Washington. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But she did have to give up a lot in order to marry him. Now, he was a good custodian of her money, and he took very good care of her children and her grandchildren, who became his own. So it's not like he was just marching in and taking over, but it was something for her to do, and it appears that she understood that. After George Washington died, it's likely that Martha Washington burned all of their correspondence, because that story is told in the family, and we don't have their correspondence, so it is the most likely thing to have happened. The couple of letters we do have, I feel are not exactly honest on George Washington's part. I'm so sorry that I've been named commander of the American forces. I didn't ask for it, but of course he showed up at the Continental Congress wearing his militia uniform.
At Mount Vernon, we tell our visitors that Martha Washington was mistress of the plantation, or that she was George Washington's partner in running the plantation. How would you describe or summarize her duties in that capacity?
A plantation mistress's duties are really extensive. She, in a situation like Mount Vernon's at that time, would be expected to feed and clothe all of the servants, unfortunately slaves. She would also be responsible for taking care of them medically. And often the plantation mistress was a doctor of sorts, had certain remedies that she had. In fact, Martha Washington has, Nellie Custis has in her housekeeping book, Martha Washington's remedy for a lump in the breast. So she had lots of different home remedies. She, of course, would be expected to preside over all of the foodstuffs, which not only meant preparing meals, but also preserving foods for the winter ahead, which is a huge operation. And in the case of Mount Vernon, there was an enormous amount of entertaining. At one point, when George Washington was discouraging his mother, a nice way of putting it, from coming to live with them, he said, "We run here a well-resorted tavern. Anybody going from north to south or south to north stops here." And of course, it was Martha Washington who had to run that tavern.
Martha's letters make it clear that family was a recurring and prominent theme in her life. How important was family to her, and what role did family play in her life?
Martha Washington cared deeply about family, of course, especially about the two grandchildren whom she was raising, Nellie and George Washington Custis. But she cared about their sisters as well, Martha and Eliza. But she also always had a niece or a cousin, some girl who was her mentee. And she was constantly teaching them basically how to live and how to come up in the world. And there was always some girl that was relying on Martha Washington. She did at one point when you forget, when she became First Lady, she had small children she was raising, Wash and Nellie. And Nellie, she said at one point, was a crazy little girl, a wild, crazy thing. So she had to rein her in.
Here at Mount Vernon, George Washington is often referred to as the precedent president. That is, he established important presidential traditions, many of which endure today, despite a lack of existing models. Similarly, Martha Washington was the First Lady. What were some of the specific challenges of this position, and how well do you think she surmounted them? What significant precedents did she set?
One of the things that's so interesting when you read about this period is how we were making it up as we went along. This is this brand new, tiny country that is filled with incredible confidence as it's embarked on this unheard of experiment of self-rule. And it is just constantly trying to figure out, okay, now what do we do? Whether that's having to do with currency or federal versus state laws, or how to have a reception for visiting dignitaries and cabinet members and members of Congress. And the country was very lucky that Martha Washington was the person in place as all of that was beginning. She understood hospitality. She had a tremendous Southern charm, but she also understood the role of formality and dignity. And she really did set the precedent for everyone who came after her. I think it's extremely likely that George Washington asked Martha Washington about matters of protocol and etiquette, which were huge. And they made a decision, for instance, not to go to private parties, which was not very pleasant for her. And their very formal levees, receptions, must have been just deadly. And she carried them on weekly, and then had dinners as well. And often at those dinners, apparently, no one said a word. Can you imagine? So I think that there was a lot of figuring it out, and that he certainly would have asked her to help figure it out. Also, Martha Washington loved beautiful clothes. She liked pretty things. And she knew to show up when she arrived in New York after he became president in homespun. She understood the public relations aspects of the job.
Correspondence and other documents indicate that there was a remarkable connection or network among the Founding Fathers. Was there a similar networked connection between Martha Washington and other founding mothers of our nation?
Some of the women were quite close to each other, and Martha Washington and Dolly Madison traded some recipes, and that's significant because keep in mind, James Madison emerged as the leader of the opposition to George Washington's party after Thomas Jefferson had gone home to Monticello. I think those women actually probably went a long way toward keeping this fragile young country from disintegrating, because they made the men behave. They'd bring them to dinner and make them sit down and share some wine and some cider and be civil to each other. And of course, Dolly Madison's sister was married to George Washington's nephew, who had also been his secretary. So there was that connection. Martha Washington was very kind to Abigail Adams, and really did reach out to her as second lady. And Abigail Adams was very admiring of Martha Washington. So there was a connection there as well. And then as the country grew and everybody came to Washington, there was a tremendous network among the women of Washington.
We've always studied the Founding Fathers in school, but in recent years there has been a surge of interest in studying the Founding Mothers. Why do you think that these women and their contributions have been overlooked for so long? And why do you think there is a growing interest in learning more about their contributions?
Well, I hope there's a surge of interest about this, because there should be. First of all, to not know the history of half of the human race is a little bit lacking, to put it mildly. But it's also true that we learn a lot more about the Founding Fathers when we study the Founding Mothers, because those bronze and marble deities that they have become flesh and blood human beings when you see them through the eyes of their mothers and wives and daughters and sisters and friends. And they are much more three-dimensional in their own writings to these women, because they're not writing for posterity. They're not as pompous. They're funny and interesting and sad when they write to women. So you have a much fuller picture of the period if you study the women as well. And of course the women are delightful. They're so much fun. You learn all kinds of great gossip.
What are your ideas of Martha Washington's views on slavery?
Martha Washington certainly was not someone who seemed to have any concern about the institution of slavery, as far as we know. She took it as just for granted that slavery existed, and she was actually quite upset when one of her household servants escaped and ran off and established her own life. And then in later years, because George Washington had written in his will that his slaves would be freed upon her death, she became frightened and lived in a house where she thought people wanted her dead. And so she then did free the slaves and then hired them, essentially, because she did need to run Mount Vernon. So I think that this is not a shining moment in Martha Washington's life. However, one of the things that strikes me as I read about life for 18th century married women in America is that they were the property of their husbands. Married women not only could not own property, but they became their husband's property. The jewelry on their bodies, their clothes, belonged to their husbands. So there's probably something of a blind spot on the part of a lot of those women, particularly Southern women, about slavery. Now, having said that, there were abolitionists, Abigail Adams among them.